Good day everyone, this is Mohammad Nasim Firdaus Shajib and I am here to talk about psycholinguistics where we will be looking for the relationship between language and brain. So let's start. In this particular slide narration, we will have discussion or we will have ideas on psycholinguistics. We'll try to know what is psycholinguistics and how does it work. And then we will also try to identify the goals and scopes of psycholinguistics. And there will also be the connection between language and human mind. In addition to that, we will have areas of psycholinguistics, the major areas of psycholinguistics, and then the relationship between language and the brain. So let's start with what is psycholinguistics. In order to identify psycholinguistics, we will try to look at psycholinguistics from the outer surface. As I have already told, psycholinguistics studies on the relationship between the human mind and language. It treats individual language user for identifying how that particular user uses a language rather than from the perspective of a social entity. That means psycholinguistics will try to identify how an individual deals with a language or individual language user deals with the language. It will not try to locate the whole community to identify the measures of the language. And psycholinguistics also try to trace similar patterns of linguistic behavior. It will not talk about the social behavior, but the linguistic behavior across language groups of individual speakers. So that means how the individual speakers speak from the part of their linguistic repertoire will be analyzed under psycholinguistics. Psycholinguistics also gain insights into the way in which the configuration of the human mind shapes communication. So ultimately, psycholinguistics is all about the analyzation of a human brain in order to identify how a language works. Whenever we will try to look at the study of psycholinguistics, it identifies that the psycholinguistic research are based on the speech and language development. And it will also look at how individuals of all ages comprehend and produce language. That means different language users from different age groups learn language differently, and psycholinguistics try to identify the connection in between that. It also tries to analyze the acquisition, comprehension, and production of language from the perspective of an individual language user. Miller and Amos in 1983 tried to grasp the scopes of psycholinguistics. They referred psycholinguistics covers the cognitive processes that make it possible to generate grammatical and meaningful sentences out of vocabulary and grammatical structure, as well as the process that make it possible to understand utterances, words, text, etc. So that means psycholinguistics will have a scope on language and brain, the paradigms, that means the behaviorism, mentalism, and interactionism, language learning and acquisition, speech perception, comprehension and production, language disorders, language and thought, and artificial intelligence. So whenever we'll try to measure the connection between language and brain, psycholinguistics will be there. Whenever we'll try to identify the behaviorism, mentalism, and interactionism in terms of psycholinguistics pattern, then definitely we need to study psycholinguistics. And then whenever we'll be learning or acquiring language, psycholinguistics will be there. When we'll try to look at speech perception, speech comprehension, speech production, and psycholinguistics will help us to identify the way it happens. And of course, different researches on language disorders. Whenever an individual fails to produce language or other issues which we refer as language disorders will also be identified under psycholinguistics. And the thought process, how an individual think in a language, also identified through psycholinguistics. And this particular data and knowledge will also try to go inside of an individual to find how artificial intelligence works, or the way artificial intelligence works can be analyzed under psycholinguistics study. So these all comes to the basic questions in psycholinguistics. So if you study in psycholinguistics, you will have the answer of these questions which you are seeing at this moment on your screen. So these are what is language, so you will get the answer of it from the perspective of an individual language user. What are its natural components? So you might have known about the components of a language, like as phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. But after studying psycholinguistics, you will also be familiar with the natural components of the language. How are those components structured, interconnected, and processed? So from those natural components, the structure, interconnection, and process of those natural components will also be answered by psycholinguistic study. And then how is language structured, instantiated, and processed in the brain? So how the pattern works in our brain and how we use those patterns whenever we try to apply or use a language can be answered under psycholinguistics. How does that structure develop, and then how does that structure support the different input and output modalities of language? So we know that we will have different input and different output as well, and how those structure will help us to have those inputs and gather those outputs will also be referred under psycholinguistics. At what level, genetic or neurological or psychological or cultural level, are those constraints operating will also be identified under psycholinguistics. How is that processing affected by extra-linguistic factors? So we are referring to attentional or memory resources, how far a student or a learner are focused on learning a language or acquiring language can be processed in here. And last but not the least, how language is affected by neurological damage. That means if a person cannot speak or use a language, and how is it connected to our neurological insight, will also be answered by psycholinguistics. So that focuses us to look on the three major goals of psycholinguistics, and those are description, explanation, and exploration. So whenever we'll try to map out the space of all existing linguistic functions, then it will be categorized under the description goals. And whenever we'll be uniting all of those functions under a neurological plausible model, which will be helpful for processing a language in our brain. And exploration, which is also a psycholinguistic goal, that is buttressing and extending the resultant models to make them more comprehensive or more elegant. So that is also one of the goals of psycholinguistics. So whenever we'll try to make a connection between language and the human mind, where human mind is referred to human brain, because we think from our brain, not our heart, and all the thinking process are generated in the upper side of our body, that means in our brain. So the notion that language is a product of the human mind, that means as the human brain, gives rise to two interconnected goals, and both concerns of psycho and linguistics. And those interconnected goals are to establish an understanding of the process which underlies the system we call language. So definitely we'll try to identify the language, and we will try to identify the process, the way language develops, or we will try to generate our understanding about how language works. So from that perspective, I should tell you that it is easy for us to work. Yes, it is easy for us to work, but if we try to explain the process of walking, it might be more difficult than walking. So that is what the integrated goal 1 says in this particular slide. And the second goal is to examine language as a product of the human mind, and thus as evidence of the way in which human beings organize their thoughts and impose patterns upon their experience. So based on an individual language user's experience, and psycholinguistics will try to examine language as a product, and it will consider the product of the human mind, and it will consider the evidence of how human beings use their language and identify the patterns based on their experiences. So these are the major areas of psycholinguistics. So till now we have identified what is psycholinguistics and how psycholinguistic study helps us to understand a language, its process, its goals, its scopes. Now we will try to look at its major areas. So language processing, that means how language processes; language storage and access, how an individual user store language components, and of course he or she accesses language components in order to use it in a social context, also one of the areas of psycholinguistics. And then comprehension theory, how a particular language user comprehend a language, and the connection between language and the brain, how an individual brain and takes language and process it for communication. And language in exceptional circumstances, we know that there are different circumstances where users are not capable of use language in a very general way. Some people have challenges as to use language, so we are considering those situations as special or exceptional circumstances. And of course the first language acquisition, so the way a particular language user learns or acquires his or her first language, is also one of the areas of psycholinguistics. So as I identified earlier, that whenever we visualize language and the mind, most of the time we consider our heart as our mind, but we all know the fact that our heart cannot generate ideas, cannot think. So what do we think is from our brain, and the connection between language and brain emerges as 3 important issues, and those are comparison, localization, and lateralization. So under comparison section, the language and brain will try to answer the question, that is, in what way do our brains differ from those of other primates which do not possess language. So we consider chimpanzees, we consider humans and monkeys as the primates. So under comparison section, whenever we will try to identify the relationship between language and brain, we'll try to compare how our brain is different from the other primates. So as the structure of our face or facial structure is similar to those primates, but how they process, how come they do not possess language and human can, and will be identified under comparison section. And under localization section, language and the brain, the relationship between language and brain, and will reveal the answer of this one, that is, where is language located in the brain. And then under lateralization section, it will try to answer the question whether there is a difference in the way the right side and left side of the brain contributes of language, the way our brain works, and how a particular part of our brain works for a particular task can be identified through lateralization, where we will find the connection between language and the brain. So let's look at the first issue, and that is comparison. According to nativists, a human infant must have some kind of genetically transmitted language faculty in order to acquire language as rapidly and successfully. So the natives of a particular language user, they believe that they build this idea that the capability of a human infant for using a language is based on the genetically transmitted language faculty, and this is why they can acquire language rapidly and successfully. But the cognitivist view is different. They try to identify the differences in the operation of the human brain and how they enable us to evolve language when other species could not. So it will try to gather the idea of how human brain has evolved for using a language, whether other species could not have that kind of capability. So the comparisons of brains. So this is a human brain. In the picture you can see the major three parts, and those are cerebrum, cerebellum, and brainstem. You can easily identify that cerebrum section is way bigger in comparison to cerebellum or brainstem. And we have categorized cerebrum under 4 major parts, and those are frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital. And all of those areas are connected with the language, and of course have their own ways to contribute for using a language. And the differences between human brains and other brains are, the first difference is the cortex, and in the human brain the cortex is much more extensive, whereas the cortex of animal brain is not as extensive as human brain. The prefrontal areas in human brain are up to 6 times bigger, which is not similar for the animal brains. Human beings have a greater proportion of the motor area to control over mouth, tongue, and jaw, and this helps the language user or the human beings to control their mouth, to control their tongue and jaw in order to produce languages through their speech organs. And also the human cerebellum is much larger relative to brain size than in other species. So already we can see that the cerebellum part is not as large as cerebrum, but if you consider the portion of cerebellum in a human brain in comparison to other species, you will find it larger. And the motor areas in between frontal and parietal lobes, you will find motor areas, and the motor areas in the human cortex have a high degree of control over the larynx for breathing and speech. So it will have more control in order to have breathe or speech. So our breathing and our speech connection is controlled based on the motor areas in the human cortex. The other issue, that is localization. Noam Chomsky identified that every normal child successfully acquires a first language, no matter what its intelligence or learning style. That means a person with a PhD degree might not face any difficulty to an illiterate person. So there might not be proper knowledge, they might not be similar in terms of their knowledge, they might not be similar in terms of their style, but still they will find themselves compatible whenever they will try to communicate each other. And that happened because language must be an independent faculty and not part of our general powers of thought and reason. So the two parts of our brain, one part is right hemisphere and another part is left hemisphere. So we consider the left hemisphere as a source of generating language, whether our right part of our brain is responsible for our thought process and reasoning. So based on the place of language in your brain, it can be said that language is from an independent faculty and it is not a part of our general powers of thought and reasoning, that means memorization and creativity and imagination. And the localization also refers that the brain processes languages in two ways, and the first way is to recognizing phonemes, and the second way that it builds meaning after recognizing the phonemes. So experts have taken two views of the place of language in the brain, and they have become successful to identify the place of a language in human brain. So two views are there from the experts. One view is that language is restricted to a single location or a limited number of locations. Another view is that language is widely distributed throughout the brain. In this picture, you can identify that in the first picture, you will find the Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca and Wernicke, they have identified the places of a language, and they have, based on their identification, language is located in these two particular regions. On the other hand, considering the latest use of technology, and that is brain imaging, it can be identified that from different perspectives. That means whenever we will have different repertoire or different exposure of language, different parts of our brain activates and it works in different responses. For example, whenever we have here a particular word for the first time, our brain functions differently if we hear that particular sound again. So another part of our brain activates whenever there is a repetition of that particular word or phrases or language. And the last section is lateralization, and under the section, the left hemisphere in most individuals is associated with analytic processing and symbolization, while the right is associated with perceptual and spatial representation. It refers that the two hemispheres have different functions, and under lateralization, it is pretty much clear that left hemisphere works with the analyzation and the process, and it refers or it helps the language user to work with the language. So there is a connection. It is pretty clear that there is a connection between language and brain, and one specific part of our brain generates one specific task or function. So language lateralization refers to the phenomenon in which one hemisphere shows greater involvement in language functions than the other. So one particular hemisphere is very limited and focused and specific task in comparison to the other. So our left part of our brain have specific tasks like analytical thought, detail-oriented perception, and the cautions, planning, logic, and of course the right field of vision and right side of motor skills. So we know that the connection is contralateral. Our left part of our brain connects with our right side of our body, and our right part of our brain connects with our left side of our body. But this development has specific time to generate. Based on Lindbergh's critical period hypothesis, a human infant from the age of 0 to 5 is very critical, because at that moment that particular child develops his or her language component in the brain, and it is the same period that helps the language user to develop in the other part of the brain, that means in the right hemisphere, if the language portion in the left hemisphere got damaged due to some accident or some occurrences. So as we have gone through, I assume that you might have critical questions which will help you to understand and comprehend the connection between language and brain, that means the psycholinguistics. So feel free to raise questions, and I will try to solve it as early as possible. And in order to prepare yourself, maybe for your exam, maybe for better understanding, you can revisit the information in the earlier slides, and you can come back here, and of course you can visit the given samples. The questions could be how language is connected with human brain, identify the emerging issues raised from the connection, how psycholinguistic analysis explores the relation between language and brain, explain in detail with examples, evaluate the emerging issues in relation to language and brain from psycholinguistics perspectives, use proper references and examples. So maybe you will try to answer these questions, or maybe you can generate your own question and try to answer it from the slides. So I believe that you should not underestimate yourself, because you are just a click away to unlock the potential of your brain, as you have been and identified from the slides till now. So your brain can do amazing things, so you just need to unlock it. So thank you very much for attending. Hopefully this helped you a lot. Please let me know whether you have any particular comments or any suggestions or any problems from these slides. I will try to rectify it and try to make it better in the coming days. So thank you again, and keep inspiring, keep believing, keep learning. That's all.